where Bush can just on his own say, hey, I'm going to bomb you people in Iran and kill you all unless you, bow down to me and kowtow to me. And he can do that because, of course, the constitutional system is entirely broken down, and he's in effect an elected dictator. But also because nobody has to worry about paying for anything. He can just have the Fed call up the Federal Reserve and say, hey, boys, print me some dough. Now, it's not quite that direct, but that is really, in effect, exactly what happens. So central banking is such an evil institution, and every libertarian, everybody who cares about peace, everybody who cares about freedom, everybody who cares about any kind of prosperity, and by the way, the entire American people's standard of living, except for the people connected with the government, is going down right now. We are all getting poorer, and if people really understood that, maybe they'd be surrounding the Fed with pitchforks and torches and calling for Mr. Bernanke and Mr. Greenspan to come out.
Now, one thing about Bush is not only is he not raising taxes, he's actually cutting taxes and sending people, quote-unquote, free money in the mail.
He is cutting taxes, although his deficits, his vast deficits, are tax increases. Because if you borrow all this money, because of course he's cut taxes, he's increased borrowing, and of course he's especially increased inflation. But the borrowing he's done, how do you pay that money back? It can only be paid back two ways, either through more inflation, even more inflation, but it's difficult for them to inflate too much because then they can't sell their bonds anymore. So really most of it has to be paid back through taxation. So there's going to be higher taxation in the future because of the deficits that Bush has run, and so we can't actually credit him with cutting taxes because the key thing is what is the size of government spending? I mean that's and of course he's vastly increasing government spending. He's like another LBJ or FDR, another one of these monsters in the White House, and he's just doing horrific damage. And I hear there are going to be a lot of demonstrations against him in Italy, which is a great thing. But if the American people had any sense whatsoever, they'd be demonstrating against him here, too, millions of us.
Well, now, I think that the current head of the central bank, Ben Bernanke, must either subscribe to some weird school of economics or be a liar, because I saw him on TV saying that if prices continue to rise, that could cause inflation. And he can't possibly mean that, can he, Lou?
Well, of course, government doesn't only depreciate the money; it depreciates our language in order to lie. So the government, the government inflation always meant, and indeed, if you look it up in the dictionary, it still means an increase in the money supply. Now, one of the effects of an increase in the money supply is rising prices. But what the government and all its kept economists have succeeded in doing is make people think of inflation as rising prices. And, of course, then you focus on, well, who are those awful people raising their prices, those horrible store owners and department store owners and businessmen and so forth. So we've got to do something about them, and maybe the government can protect us. So this is the government. This is why another favor, just to get on a slightly different subject, of the way the government does this in contemporary terms is they've always referred to violence in Iraq or Afghanistan. More violence, less violence. We want to have less violence. This is in order to make it seem like it might be the Crips and the Bloods or regular crime. It's actually, of course, fighting and war they're talking about. When they say there's more violence, they mean more fighting. But they don't want to discuss fighting, just like nobody is ever wounded, by the way. You may notice soldiers are injured. But
Right.
They're never wounded. You could be injured in a car accident.
Yeah, there was even an article about how this is a few years back where someone wrote about how they had instructions from on high at their newspaper that we have changed our language on that. The specific instructions.
It's they do it across all kinds of, in all areas. Guido Holzman, who's an economist, one of the senior scholars of the Mises Institute and a professor of economics in France, once gave maybe I'll have to find that and put that up on LewRockwell.com, but it gave a great paper on government's depreciation of the language. It's all deliberate, and the government, we always have to remember, in the words of Murray Rothbard, is a band of thieves writ large. I mean, they try to portray themselves as being, interested in the public good and the national good, and the national defense and, all that sort of stuff. But they're in effect a band of thieves who then have to disguise that so that everybody will keep kowtowing to them and turning over their money and their children to them. Of course, some of us, that's why we're libertarians. We don't want to turn over our money or our children or our lives or our freedom or our privacy to that group of criminals in Washington, D.C.
Well, the way Ron Paul tells the story, it seems like most members of Congress, perhaps virtually all members of Congress, are as in the dark about how this works as the average American. I mean, to me, the contrast between your simple, honest, direct language and describing how this works makes it seem so obvious, and yet what we're talking about is basically a big secret here in America and apparently even within the halls of power in D.C.
Well, another aspect of this, and I actually fear this for the future, and I'm so old that I remember this very well when Nixon put price and wage controls, ended the last tie between the dollar and gold, and said that this was because of inflation, and he was going to get rid of inflation. Well, Nixon didn't believe that price and wage controls could cure inflation, which again is a monetary phenomenon. He didn't believe that it was going to make people more prosperous or whatever, but it had the success like all government programs of transferring the blame, or at least one aspect of a success of a government program, in transferring the blame from the government and its central bank to businessmen. So the government is trying to help you people. We're trying to keep the prices down, but those rotten businessmen are either trying to raise their prices or maybe they're making the chocolate bar smaller because they have to charge the same price. They're ripping you off. So watch out! It's the businessman, and only the government can protect you. So this is I must say I wouldn't be surprised to see George Bush, who, as far as I can tell, is a fascist. I mean, who believes in the corporate state, who believes in militarism, belligerent nationalism, abolition of civil liberties, demonization of the other. I mean, all the things we think of that go along with fascism. That's the Bush regime. So they certainly wouldn't hesitate to put price and wage controls on. And so deep is I'm afraid, the ignorance of the American people on economics, although there are many of us who have dedicated our lives to trying to change that he might get away with it. Or maybe not. We just have to see. I mean, maybe the American people will have had enough. It's one reason the government doesn't want a recession or a depression and doesn't want hyperinflation and that sort of thing, because it's destabilizing. And they think they can handle things. They think that they can turn all these bad things that they've created to their own advantage, but they can't be sure. So they're always slightly worried about the effects can be destabilizing for the state. And as Murray Rothbard shown us in the works of the great Etienne de la Boétie, the French theorist of the 16th century, or David Hume, Mises, Rothbard himself, government depends on the consent of the governed. And the reason for that, even a dictatorial government, even Hitler or Stalin, Mao Zedong, Castro, whatever, they depend on the consent of the governed. That is, people at least think that if they organize and bring danger on themselves in order to try to get rid of the government, that might make things worse. Of course, there's huge propaganda involved and everything. But the reason that it has to depend on the consent of the governed is because the government is necessarily a minority. They can't live it up at our expense if they're the majority living off the minority. It has to be a relatively tiny minority living off the rest of the people. And so that actually requires our obedience. If the people ever stop giving their obedience, then even the biggest, most powerful, most police-statey government will crumble before your eyes like an old newspaper.
Like the Soviet Union.
Like the Soviet Union, like Iran under the Shah, which was an example of this, like the British India government as against Gandhi and all his followers. So when, like in Romania and so forth, and when this all happened, of course, in the Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, the U.S. went on an unbelievable offensive to make sure that massive governments would be left in power. They sent over, all kinds of money, all kinds of intellectuals, all kinds of experts to immediately make sure. I'm just thinking of one particular case that Poland would have an OSHA,